This second video in the series looking at referencing with Hull Harvard and APA 7th concentrates on mastering your in-text citations. In-text citations can be parenthetical or narrative. Parenthetical references are the most common type of reference. They put the emphasis on what was said rather than who said it, which is usually more important. The reference is entirely in round brackets or parentheses and is part of the sentence, so it should always come before the full stop. It may not always be at the end of the sentence, it may come before a comma, for example, especially if you're referring to several different sources in the sentence. With a narrative reference, the author is part of your sentence. It makes no sense without it, so just the date is put in brackets. They're more often used when it is important who the information came from, perhaps a known authority in the field or a respected organisation such as that shown here. Note that whichever type of reference you use, if you are citing a person, not an organisation, it is only ever the surname that is included, no given names or initials. When you are giving a direct quote, so the exact words from the source, and that's indicated by double quotation marks, you will need to give a page number so that the reader could find that directly if they wanted to. The format of this differs slightly between Hull Harvard and APA referencing, with Harvard just using a colon to separate it from the date and APA adding a comma and the letter P, or sometimes PP if the quote goes between two pages. If your source doesn't have page numbers, such as a web page, then this can be omitted. If your quote is a long one, which is 30 words or more in Hull Harvard, you would not put it in double quotation marks in your text. Instead, you'd put it in a separate paragraph which is indented by 1 centimetre from both sides. You should also put it in single line spacing, whilst the rest of your document should be in 1.5 line spacing. With APA, longer quotes are 40 words or more, and the indented paragraph is not put into single line spacing, but keeps the same double line spacing that is expected of the rest of the document. So these are the general conventions for author names in both Harvard and APA, and I'll just briefly go through them. Single authors are the most straightforward, with just the surname and year of publication, either all in brackets if they're given after a point, or just the date in brackets if the author's name is part of the narrative. If there are two joint authors, the only difference is that for a parenthetical citation, we combine them with the ampersand symbol, and for narrative citations with the full word and, due to it being part of the sentence. If there are 3 or more authors, you just give the first author's surname followed by et al. This is an abbreviated form of et alia, which means and others in Latin. Everything else stays the same as for the single author. Just remember to always follow the al with a full stop, as it's an abbreviation. You would give all the authors' names in the reference list. For group or corporate authors, it will depend on whether you want to introduce an abbreviated form of the group name to use later in the document. You don't need to do this if you only mention them once. If that's the case, you just put the name of the organisation in full, followed by the date in the same way as a single author. If you want to give the abbreviation, then you can do it as part of the reference. For a parenthetical one, you put it in square brackets after the organisation's name within the round brackets. For a narrative citation, the abbreviation is given within the same round brackets as the date. For subsequent citations, you only need to give the abbreviated form. You can use the abbreviated form in your reference list as well. Sometimes you want to refer to more than one source at the same point, and here are the conventions for how to do that. If they are completely different authors, separate the citations with semicolons, giving them in chronological order with the earliest year first. If they're from the same year, use alphabetical order. If you're referring to two sources by the same author but different years, you just list the years separated by commas after the author name. Again, you put them in chronological order. If you have the same author and the same year, regardless of whether they're together or at completely different parts of the document, you would distinguish each source by adding A, B, C, etc. to the date. And this is repeated in the reference list so that your reader can tell which source is the relevant one. A couple of other things to mention. If there's no date, as on some web pages or very old sources, then just add ND in its place. Remember, you can use the copyright date at the bottom of a page as the date on a web page. If there's no obvious author or editor, not even an obvious group, you can just put the name of the title of the work instead. Finally, sometimes you'll find that you want to reference something that another author referenced in the source you read, but you can't find that particular source yourself. When that's the case, we call it a secondary reference. Just make sure it's really clear in the text which was the source you read and put that source in your reference list. There are some examples here, so you can see Harrison was cited in Smithson, that's the book we read, suggested that. And the same in the second one, it was the Avineri book we read which gave the quote from Marx, but we don't know which source that originally came from. So it's the Avineri source that we reference. Both the Smithson and Avineri sources would go in the reference list. You don't always need the date of the secondary reference like in the first example. That's just given if there was more than one source by Harrison cited in Smithson and we need to be able to show which one. This should give you all of the information you need to be able to cite within your text. But please contact the skills team if you have any queries.